Intro by Jobin Berman. Jobin Berman, hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the JJ Berman Experience. I'm Jobin Berman, and I'm here to introduce your host for today, JJ Berman, and his special guest, Dean Bibb. They'll be diving into the absurdities of life, existential crises, stand-up comedy, and even cheese. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Jobin Berman, out. Main podcast. JJ Berman, welcome, welcome, welcome. This is JJ Berman, and you're tuned into the JJ Berman Experience. Today, we have a very special guest, the one and only Dean Bibb. Dean, how are you doing? Dean Bibb, I'm doing great, JJ, thanks for having me. I'm excited to get absurd. JJ Berman, fantastic. So, let's kick things off with a joke. What do you call cheese that's not yours? Dean Bibb, nacho cheese. First ad break, Burrito Fray dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman number 2, hey folks, JJ Berman here, but now I'm a bean. That's right, I'm dipping myself into Burrito Fray's pinto bean dip with infused electrolytes. Remember, dip into life, dip into Burrito Fray. Back to podcast. JJ Berman, haha, classic. So, Dean, you host your own podcast where you talk about existential crises. How do you find happiness while discussing such heavy topics? Dean Bibb, well, JJ, it's all about balance. You have to laugh at the absurdity of life. Like, have you ever thought about how we're all just cosmic dust? JJ Berman number 3, oh, absolutely. I mean, what if we're all just a simulation? Dean Bibb, wait, there are 2 of you now. Second ad break, Burrito Fray dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman number 4 and number 5, double the JJ, double the dip. Dip into life, dip into Burrito Fray. Back to podcast. JJ Berman number 6, number 7, number 8, Dean, let's get back to the meaning of life. Is it 42, is it happiness, or is it the perfect stand-up routine? Dean Bibb, I'm starting to question reality here. Why are there so many of you? JJ Berman number 9, number 10, number 11, number 12, the more, the merrier. So, Dean, what's your go-to joke when you're feeling down? Dean Bibb, I usually go with, why did the Scarecrow win an award? Because he was outstanding in his field. But seriously, what's happening here? Final ad break, Burrito Fray dip for pinto beans. An army of JJ Bermans, we're taking over, one dip at a time. Dip into life, dip into Burrito Fray. Conclusion. JJ Berman #infinity, so, Dean, any final thoughts on the meaning of life? Dean Bibb, at this point, I think the meaning of life is just to survive this podcast. JJ Berman #infinity, fair enough. Thanks for joining us on this increasingly absurd journey. Remember folks, dip into life, dip into Burrito Fray. Dean Bibb, thanks for having me, JJ, or should I say J.J.S. JJ Berman #infinity, it's been a pleasure, Dean. And to our listeners, stay tuned for more absurdity on the next episode of the JJ Berman Experience. Main podcast. JJ Berman #infinity, welcome back, everyone. This is JJ Berman, and you're tuned into part 2 of our 20-part series. Dean Bibb, how are you holding up? Dean Bibb, I'm still here, JJ, still trying to make sense of this madness. JJ Berman #infinity, fantastic. Now, let's address the elephant in the room. Do you smell that? Dean Bibb, yeah, it's like a mix of old cheese and existential dread. First ad break, Burrito Fray dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman #infinity superscript 2, quadruple your pleasure, quadruple your dip. Dip into life, dip into Burrito Fray. Back to podcast. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 3, so, we've been talking about this smell for a while now, but then it hit me, no one else can smell it. It's just us, in this room, with an infinite number of me. Dean Bip, that's a relief and a concern at the same time. Let's shift gears. Have you heard of the digital celery man? JJ Berman hashtag infinity, oh, the guy with his own podcast? Yeah, he's a legend. What's your favorite joke about him? Dean Bip, why did the digital celery man get kicked out of the grocery store? Because he kept stocking the vegetables. Second ad break, Lorito Frey dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman hashtag infinity and hashtag infinity, dip into the infinite. Dip into life, dip into Lorito Frey. Back to podcast. JJ Berman hashtag infinity, hashtag infinity, hashtag infinity, haha, that's a good one, Dean. So, what do you think the digital celery man's take on the meaning of life would be? Dean Bip, probably something like, crunch into life until you find your inner stock. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, hashtag infinity superscript 1 superscript 1, hashtag infinity superscript 1 superscript 2, brilliant. I think we're getting closer to unraveling the mysteries of the universe, one stock at a time. Final ad break, Lorito Frey dip for pinto beans. A multiverse of JJ Bermans, we're not just dipping into life, we're dipping into alternate realities. Dip into life, dip into Lorito Frey. Conclusion. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1 superscript 3, Dean, any final thoughts on today's episode? Dean Bip, I think I need to meditate for a week straight after this. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, sounds like a plan. Thanks for joining us, Dean. And to our listeners, stay tuned for part 3 of this 20-part series. Intro by Jobin Berman. Jobin Berman, hello, dear listeners. Welcome to part 3 of the 20-part series of the JJ Berman Experience. I'm Jobin Berman, and I'm here to prep you for another roller coaster of a podcast with JJ Berman and Dean Bip. Today, they'll be diving into the concept of time, the paradox of choice, and the mystery of the missing sock dimension. Let's get started. Main podcast. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, welcome back, everyone. This is JJ Berman, and you're tuned into part 3 of our 20-part series. Dean Bip, how are you feeling today? Dean Bip, I've entered a state of Zen acceptance at this point, JJ. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, excellent. Now, let's talk about time. Do you think it's linear, cyclical, or just an illusion? Dean Bip, I'd say it's more like a spiral, constantly turning but never quite repeating. First ad break, Lorito Frey dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, time for a dip into the future. Dip into life, dip into Lorito Frey. Back to podcast. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, fascinating perspective, Dean. Now, let's switch gears to the paradox of choice. Do you think having too many options can be paralyzing? Dean Bip, absolutely, it's like standing in front of an infinite sock drawer and not knowing which pair to pick. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 1, speaking of socks, have you ever wondered where all the missing socks go? Dean Bip, the missing sock dimension. A place where all lost socks find their purpose. Second ad break, Lorito Frey dip for pinto beans. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 2 and hashtag infinity superscript 2 superscript 1, double the dip, double the dimensions. Dip into life, dip into Lorito Frey. Back to podcast. JJ Berman hashtag infinity superscript 2 superscript 2, hashtag infinity superscript 2 superscript 3, hashtag infinity superscript 2, haha, that's a good one, Dean. So, do you think socks in the missing sock dimension are happier? Dean Bip, I'd like to think they're living their best lives, paired with socks they actually like. JJ Berman #Infinity Superscript 2, #Infinity Superscript 2, #Infinity Superscript 2, that's a comforting thought. Maybe we can all learn something from those socks. Final ad break, Lorito Frey dip for pinto beans. An infinite universe of JJ Bermans, we're dipping into parallel universes now. Dip into life, dip into Lorito Frey. Conclusion. JJ Berman #Infinity Superscript 2, Dean, any final reflections on today's episode? Dean Bip, I'm starting to think that the missing sock dimension might be a great place for a vacation. Intro by Jobin Berman. Jobin Berman, welcome back, everyone. This is part 4 of the 20-part series of the JJ Berman Experience. I'm Jobin Berman, and today's episode promises to be another wild ride with JJ Berman and Dean Bip. They'll be discussing the intricacies of podcast hosting and the art of keeping sponsorships. Let's jump right in. Main podcast. JJ Berman #Infinity Superscript 3, hey folks, welcome back to part 4 of our 20-part series. Dean Bip, how's it going? Dean Bip, I'm still here, JJ, still trying to keep up with your exponential growth. JJ Berman #Infinity Superscript 3 Superscript 1, haha, you and me both. Now, I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of these Lorito Frey ads. Interruption, CEO of Lorito Frey calls in. CEO of Lorito Frey, JJ, I heard that. We're pulling our sponsorship. Effective immediately. JJ Berman #Infinity Superscript 3 Superscript 2, well, that's unfortunate. But the show must go on. Transition to Dean Bip's podcast. Dean Bip, why don't we continue this conversation on my podcast? We can talk about the art of podcast hosting and how to keep sponsorships. Main podcast. JJ Berman, welcome back to the JJ Berman Experience, folks. This is episode 6, and we've got Dean Bip back with us. How are you, Dean? Dean Bip, I'm good, JJ, thanks for having me back. JJ Berman, absolutely. Now, as some of you may know, we recently lost our sponsorship with Lorito Frey. Dean, you've been in the podcast game for a while. Any tips on keeping sponsorships? Dean Bip, well, JJ, it's all about building a relationship with your sponsors. You have to believe in the product you're promoting, and it helps to keep open lines of communication with the company. Sponsor-less ad break. JJ Berman, normally, this would be an ad break, but let's take this time to remind our listeners to support the show by subscribing and leaving a review. Back to podcast. JJ Berman, great advice, Dean. Now, let's talk about the art of podcast hosting. What's your secret to keeping the audience engaged? Dean Bip, it's all about authenticity, JJ. People can tell when you're not being genuine. Also, it helps to have interesting guests and topics. JJ Berman, absolutely, couldn't agree more. And speaking of interesting topics, what's coming up on your podcast? Dean Bip, we're diving into the concept of free will next week. Should be a mind bender. Final segment, listener questions. JJ Berman, we've got a question from a listener, how do you handle negative feedback? Dean Bip, take it with a grain of salt but also see if there's any constructive criticism you can use to improve. JJ Berman, wise words, Dean. And with that, we're wrapping up episode 6. Intro by Jobin Berman. Jobin Berman, hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 7 of the JJ Berman Experience. I'm Jobin Berman, and today we have another exciting episode for you. JJ Berman and Dean Bip will be discussing their love for podcasting, with a brief detour into the world of The Big Lebowski. Let's get started. Main podcast. JJ Berman, welcome back, folks. This is episode 7 of the JJ Berman Experience, and we've got Dean Bip with us again. How's it going, Dean? Dean Bip, I'm doing well, JJ, always a pleasure to be here. JJ Berman, fantastic. Now, before we dive into the world of podcasting, I have to ask, are you a fan of The Big Lebowski? Dean Bip, oh, absolutely. The dude abides, man. JJ Berman, haha, indeed he does. Alright, let's get back to our main topic. What do you love most about being a podcast host? Sponsor-less ad break. JJ Berman, quick reminder to our listeners, if you enjoy the show, please subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us out. Back to podcast. Dean Bip, what I love most about podcasting is the ability to connect with people. It's an intimate medium where you can really dive deep into topics and share ideas. JJ Berman, I couldn't agree more. For me, it's also about the freedom to explore a wide range of subjects and the opportunity to learn something new every day. Dean Bip, absolutely, the learning aspect is huge. You get to be both a teacher and a student in this role. JJ Berman, so true. Now, what's one episode from your podcast that you're particularly proud of? Dean Bip, I did an episode on the philosophy of humor that I really enjoyed. It was a deep dive, but we also had a lot of fun with it. Final segment, listener questions. JJ Berman, we have a listener question. What's the most challenging part of being a podcast host? Dean Bip, I'd say it's finding the balance between entertaining your audience and staying true to your own interests and values. JJ Berman, well said, Dean. And that brings us to the end of episode 7. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, thanks for being here and sharing your love for podcasting. Dean Bip, thanks for having me, JJ. It's always a great time. JJ Berman, and to our listeners, stay tuned for more episodes of the JJ Berman Experience. Main podcast. JJ Berman, welcome back, everyone. This is episode 8 of the JJ Berman Experience, and we've got Dean Bip back in the studio. How are you, Dean? Dean Bip, I'm doing well, JJ, always a joy to be here. JJ Berman, fantastic. Now, before we delve into our main topic, let's touch on life for a moment. What's your philosophy on life, Dean? Dean Bip, the big question. I'd say my philosophy is to live authentically and to be present in each moment. JJ Berman, wise words. Alright, let's pivot back to podcasting. What keeps you coming back to the microphone? Sponsor-less ad break. JJ Berman, a quick shout out to our listeners. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe and leave a review. Your support means the world to us. Back to podcast. Dean Bip, what keeps me coming back is the sense of community. Podcasting allows me to connect with like-minded individuals and engage in meaningful conversations. JJ Berman, I couldn't agree more. For me, it's also the thrill of discovery. Every episode is a new adventure, a new topic to explore. Dean Bip, absolutely, the sense of discovery is exhilarating. You never know where the conversation will lead, and that's the beauty of it. JJ Berman, so true. Now, what's one piece of advice you'd give to aspiring podcast hosts? Dean Bip, be yourself. Authenticity shines through, and listeners can tell when you're being genuine. Final segment, listener questions. JJ Berman, we have a listener question. What's the most rewarding part of being a podcast host? Dean Bip, the most rewarding part for me is when listeners reach out to say that an episode has impacted them in a meaningful way. JJ Berman, well said, Dean. And that brings us to the end of episode 8. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, thanks for being here and sharing your passion for podcasting. Dean Bip, thanks for having me, JJ. It's always a pleasure. JJ Berman, and to our listeners, stay tuned for more episodes of the JJ Berman Experience. Dean Bib, absolutely, JJ. Let's keep the conversation going. JJ Berman, fantastic. Now, before we continue, we have a special caller on the line. It's the Digital Celery Man from his own podcast. How are you, Digital Celery Man? Digital Celery Man, hey, JJ, hey Dean. I'm doing great, just wanted to call in and bring some crunchy, green vibes to your show. Dean Bib, crunchy and green? Sounds like a good time. Back to podcast. JJ Berman, Digital Celery Man, since you're here, what do you love about podcasting? Digital Celery Man, oh, man, where do I start? I love the freedom to be as weird and as wonderful as I want. Plus, it's a great way to connect with people who are into the same strange stuff. JJ Berman, that's awesome. Dean, any thoughts? Dean Bib, I think that's the beauty of podcasting. It's a platform where everyone can find their tribe, no matter how niche their interests are. JJ Berman, absolutely. Now, Digital Celery Man, you're known for your uplifting content. Any tips for keeping the energy high in a podcast? Digital Celery Man, sure thing. Keep the conversation flowing and don't be afraid to go off script. Sometimes the best moments happen when you least expect them. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have a listener question: how do you handle the technical aspects of podcasting? Dean Bib, I'd say don't let the tech intimidate you. Start simple and gradually upgrade as you go along. Digital Celery Man, totally agree, Dean. And don't forget to have fun with it. If you're not enjoying the process, it'll come through in the final product. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Digital Celery Man, thanks for calling in and adding some extra crunch to our show. Digital Celery Man, anytime, JJ. Keep up the great work, you guys. Dean Bib, thanks for joining us, Digital Celery Man. It was a blast. JJ Berman, welcome back to part 9, everyone. Dean, how are you holding up? Dean Bib, I'm in it for the long haul, JJ. Let's keep the absurdity rolling. JJ Berman, excellent. Now, we've got a special segment today. We're diving into the world of Jobin podcast, which, as we all know, is a realm of pure absurdity. Dean, have you ever listened to it? Dean Bib, oh, absolutely. It's like stepping into a Salvador Dali painting but with more sound effects. Special segment, the world of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, so, in the world of Jobin, they recently discussed the existential implications of sentient spaghetti. Thoughts? Dean Bib, the age-old question, to eat or not to eat? If the spaghetti is sentient, does it have the right to avoid the boiling pot? JJ Berman, exactly. And what if the spaghetti wants to become a podcast host? Dean Bib, then we'd have some stiff competition. Imagine a podcast hosted by spaghetti that can feel and think. The possibilities are endless. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have a listener question: how do you keep your podcast absurd yet meaningful? Dean Bib, the key is balance. You can venture into the realm of the absurd, but you also need moments of sincerity to ground the conversation. JJ Berman, well said, Dean. Absurdity with a purpose can be incredibly impactful. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's dive into the world of Jobin? Dean Bib, it's a reminder that podcasting is a medium where anything is possible, even discussions about sentient spaghetti. Dean Bib, just that the realm of podcasting is as vast as the sky where even clouds might one day have a voice. JJ Berman, well said. And to our listeners, stay tuned for part 11 of this 20-part series. And that wraps up part 10 of the 20-part series of the JJ Berman Experience with Dean Bib. we delved deeper into the world of Jobin podcast, discussing the absurd yet captivating idea of clouds. Dean Bip, absolutely, JJ. Let's keep pushing the boundaries of podcasting. JJ Berman, great. Now, continuing with our exploration of the world of Jobin podcast, they recently had an episode where they discussed the idea of socks having personalities. What's your take? Dean Bip, the inner lives of socks. I've always suspected that my left sock is a bit of an introvert, while the right one is the life of the party. Special segment, The World of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, haha, that's hilarious. Imagine a dating app for socks to find their perfect match. Dean Bip, soccer. Where lonely socks can swipe right to find their soulmate. JJ Berman, brilliant. Now, let's switch gears a bit and tell some jokes. Remember, the only rule is no food jokes. Dean Bip, alright, here's one. Why did the Scarecrow win an award? JJ Berman, I don't know, why? Dean Bip, because he was outstanding in his field. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have a listener question. How do you keep the humor alive in such long podcast series? Dean Bip, variety is the spice of life. Mixing in jokes, absurd topics, and serious discussions keeps both the hosts and the audience engaged. JJ Berman, couldn't agree more. Humor is an essential ingredient in the podcasting recipe. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's absurd journey into the world of Jobin? Dean Bip, it's a reminder that the only limit to podcasting is your imagination. Whether it's socks with personalities or clouds with voting rights, anything is possible. JJ Berman, excellent. Now, let's dive back into the world of Jobin podcast. They recently pondered whether parallel universes have their own podcasts. Thoughts? Dean Bip, the multiverse of podcasting. Imagine a universe where podcasts host people instead of the other way around. Special segment, The World of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, that's mind-bending. Welcome to the Human Experience, hosted by the JJ Berman podcast. Dean Bip, exactly. And the podcast would interview different versions of us from parallel universes. JJ Berman, wow, that's a trip. Alright, let's keep the humor going. Remember, no food jokes allowed. Dean Bip, got it? Here's one, why did the bicycle fall over? JJ Berman, I'm all ears. Dean Bip, because it was too tired. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question. How do you keep the energy high in a long podcast series? Dean Bip, it's all about pacing and variety. You can't go full throttle all the time, you need moments of reflection to balance out the high energy segments. JJ Berman, absolutely. A good podcast is like a roller coaster, it has its ups and downs but keeps you engaged throughout. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any parting thoughts as we wrap up part 12? Dean Bip, just that the realm of podcasting is as limitless as our imagination. Whether we're talking about parallel universes or personality-filled socks, the sky's the limit. JJ Berman, well said. And to our listeners, stay tuned for part 13 of this 20-part series. JJ Berman, welcome to Lucky Part 13. Dean, are you superstitious at all? Dean Bip, not really, but I do avoid walking under ladders. You know, just in case. JJ Berman, fair enough. Now, let's get back into the world of Jobin podcast. They recently discussed the concept of time-traveling snails. What's your take? Dean Bip, the slowest time travelers in the universe. Imagine going back in time but at a snail's pace. You'd arrive just in time to miss everything. Special segment, The World of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, haha, that's hilarious. Imagine a snail trying to prevent a historical event but arriving a decade late. Dean Bip, I'm here to stop the Y2K bug. Oh, it's 2010? Never mind. JJ Berman, perfect. Alright, let's keep the laughs coming. Remember, no food jokes. Dean Bip, sure thing. Why did the golfer bring 2 pairs of pants? JJ Berman, I have no idea, why? Dean Bip, in case he got a hole in one. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question, how do you keep the conversation flowing in a long podcast series? Dean Bip, it's all about active listening and being responsive. You have to be present in the conversation and willing to go where it takes you. JJ Berman, absolutely. Being present is key to keeping the conversation engaging and dynamic. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's absurd topics? Dean Bip, just that absurdity is a playground for the imagination. Whether it's time-traveling snails or sentient socks, there's no limit to what we can explore. JJ Berman, well said. And to our listeners, stay tuned for part 14 of this 20-part series. JJ Berman, welcome to part 14. Dean, are you ready to keep the absurdity going? Dean Bip, absolutely, JJ. The weirder, the better. JJ Berman, fantastic. Now, let's dive back into the world of Jobin podcast. They recently had an episode about the emotional lives of rocks. Thoughts? Dean Bip, the stoic yet sensitive world of rocks. I've always wondered if pebbles are just baby boulders waiting to grow up. Special segment, The World of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, that's a great point. Imagine a rock going through its rebellious phase. Dean Bip, I'm not just a stepping stone, Mom. I want to be a mountain. JJ Berman, haha, perfect. Alright, let's keep the humor flowing. Remember, no food jokes. Dean Bip, got it? Why did the math book look sad? JJ Berman, I'm intrigued, why? Dean Bip, because it had too many problems. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question, how do you keep the podcast fresh and engaging? Dean Bip, it's all about mixing it up. Different topics, different formats, and even different guests can add a new flavor to each episode. JJ Berman, absolutely. Variety is the key to longevity in podcasting. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's dive into the emotional lives of rocks? Dean Bip, just that the world is full of wonder, and even the most mundane things can be fascinating if you look at them from a different angle. JJ Berman, that would be incredible. Imagine the diplomatic relations between the country of country and the hip-hop nation. Dean Bip, we propose a musical exchange program, you send us your banjos, and we'll send you our turntables. JJ Berman, haha, perfect. Alright, let's keep the humor flowing. Remember, no food jokes. Dean Bip, understood. Why did the computer go to art school? JJ Berman, do tell. Dean Bip, because it wanted to learn how to draw a better bite. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question, how do you keep the podcast from becoming monotonous? Dean Bip, the key is to be genuinely interested in what you're talking about. If you're excited, your audience will be too. JJ Berman, absolutely. Authenticity shines through, and it's contagious. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's exploration of musical genres as countries? Dean Bip, just that it's a fun way to think about how our interests shape our identities, even on a geopolitical scale. JJ Berman, here we are at part 16, Dean. How's your energy level? Dean Bip, through the roof, JJ. I'm ready for more absurdity. JJ Berman, Fantastic. Now, let's dive back into the world of Jobin podcast. They recently discussed the concept of invisible art galleries. Thoughts? Dean Bip, the unseen beauty of art. It's like a museum for your imagination. Special segment, the world of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, spot on. Imagine the reviews, I didn't see anything, but it moved me deeply. Dean Bip, wow, now you're onto something. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. JJ Berman, haha, thanks. Alright, let's tell some jokes about being podcast hosts. Dean Bip, sure thing. Why did the podcast host get kicked out of the library? JJ Berman, spot on. I mean, why? Dean Bip, because he wouldn't stop asking for sound bites. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question. How do you keep the podcast engaging when you're not actually listening to each other? Dean Bip, spot on. I mean, the key is to have a genuine connection with your co-host. Even if you zone out for a moment, you can always pick up the thread. JJ Berman, wow, now you're onto something. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. Authenticity is the cornerstone of any good podcast. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's discussion about invisible art galleries? Dean Bip, spot on. I mean, it's a reminder that the world is full of unseen wonders, just waiting to be discovered. JJ Berman, wow, now you're onto something. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. And to our listeners, stay tuned for part 17 of this 20-part series. JJ Berman, we've made it to part 17, Dean. How's your philosophical mindset today? Dean Bip, oh, it's buzzing, JJ. I'm ready to dive into the deep end of thought. JJ Berman, excellent. Now, let's get back into the world of Jobin podcast. They recently pondered whether a tree that falls in a virtual forest makes a sound. Thoughts? Dean Bip, the digital twist on a classic conundrum. If no one's there to hear it, does it make a pixelated thud? Special segment, the world of Jobin podcast. JJ Berman, spot on. It's like asking if a deleted file really disappears or if it goes to some sort of digital afterlife. Dean Bip, wow, now you're onto something. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. JJ Berman, thanks. Alright, let's keep the humor going with some podcast host jokes. Dean Bip, sure. Why did the podcast host refuse to play cards? JJ Berman, spot on. I mean, why? Dean Bip, because he was afraid of getting dealt a bad episode. Listener questions. JJ Berman, we have another listener question. How do you balance deep philosophical discussions with humor? Dean Bip, spot on. Philosophy and humor are two sides of the same coin. One helps us explore the world, and the other helps us cope with it. JJ Berman, wow, now you're onto something. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. It's all about the yin and yang of intellectual and emotional engagement. Conclusion. JJ Berman, Dean, any final thoughts on today's philosophical musings? Dean Bip, spot on. I mean, philosophy allows us to question the world around us, even if that world is virtual. JJ Berman, welcome to part 18. Dean, how are you feeling as we approach the end of this series? Dean Bip, I'm feeling a mix of excitement and nostalgia, JJ. It's been a wild ride. JJ Berman, it sure has. Now, let's talk about something we've never touched on before, the ethics of AI. Dean Bip, the question of whether machines can possess morality. It's a fascinating topic. Special segment, Ethics and AI. JJ Berman, absolutely. Do you think AI could ever be programmed to make ethical decisions? Dean Bip, stop bean dipping yourself. I mean, it's a complex issue. Ethics aren't universal, so programming a machine to be ethical is a slippery slope. J.J. Berman, very true. It's a topic that could have far-reaching implications for society. The J.J. Berman Experience with Dean Bibb, Part 19. J.J. Berman, on to Part 19. Let's switch gears and talk about the power of storytelling. Dean Bibb, storytelling is the oldest form of entertainment and education. It's how we make sense of the world. Special segment, The Power of Storytelling. J.J. Berman, exactly. Do you have a favorite story that has impacted your life? Dean Bibb, stop bean dipping yourself. I mean, there are so many, but one that comes to mind is The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. It's a template for so many stories and life experiences. J.J. Berman, that's a great choice. Stories shape our understanding of the world and ourselves. The J.J. Berman Experience with Dean Bibb, Part 20. J.J. Berman, and here we are, the final part, Part 20. Dean, any reflections on our journey? Dean Bibb, it's been an incredible experience, J.J. From the absurd to the profound, we've covered it all. Special segment, Reflections and Farewell. J.J. Berman, absolutely. It's been a pleasure exploring all these topics with you. Dean Bibb, stop bean dipping yourself. I mean, the pleasure has been all mine, J.J. Here's to more adventures in podcasting. J.J. Berman, cheers to that, Dean. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this 20-part journey. Until next time. J.J. Berman, here we are at Part 19, just one away from the grand finale. Dean, how are you holding up? Dean Bibb, I'm feeling a mix of anticipation and reflection, J.J. It's been quite the journey. J.J. Berman, it sure has. Now, let's delve into something we've never discussed, the concept of time. Dean Bibb, the ever-elusive fourth dimension. It's a topic that can bend your mind if you think about it too much. Special segment, the concept of time. J.J. Berman, absolutely. Do you think time is linear, or is it more of a loop? Dean Bibb, stop bean dipping yourself. I mean, the nature of time is still one of the greatest mysteries in physics and philosophy. Some theories suggest it could be both linear and cyclical. J.J. Berman, intriguing. The concept of time has always fascinated humanity, and it's something we still don't fully understand. The J.J. Berman Experience with Dean Bibb, Part 20. J.J. Berman, and here we are, the final part, Part 20. Dean, any reflections on our journey? Dean Bibb, it's been an incredible experience, J.J. From the absurd to the profound, we've covered it all. Special segment, Reflections and Farewell. J.J. Berman, absolutely. It's been a pleasure exploring all these topics with you. Dean Bibb, stop bean dipping yourself. I mean, the pleasure has been all mine, J.J. Here's to more adventures in podcasting. J.J. Berman, cheers to that, Dean. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this 20-part journey. Until next time. All J.J. Bermans, wow, that's deep, man. Dean Bibb, as deep as a will of Gouda. Outro music playing. Jobin Berman, outro voice, and that's a wrap. Thanks for joining us on this roller coaster of existentialism, comedy, and dairy products. Until next time, keep questioning, keep laughing, and keep being absurd.